The abyss calls. The ocean had always been a mystery, but the Hadal-9 Expedition was determined to unveil its secrets. The research vessel Orpheus floated like a lone sentinel over the Mariana Trench, its hull groaning as waves lapped against its sides. It was supposed to be a routine mission, a deep-sea survey, cataloging undiscovered species in the Hadal Zone, the deepest parts of the ocean. But something was wrong. Dr. Evelyn Carter, the lead marine biologist, stood in front of the sonar monitor, her fingers twitching. The screen flickered with static before revealing an anomaly, a signal pulsing from 10,900 meters below the surface. No known life form in the trench should be able to generate such a frequency. "What the hell is that?" muttered Lucas Ung, the ship's sonar technician. His voice barely carried over the hum of machinery. Evelyn leaned in. The signal wasn't random. It came in bursts, a pattern, almost like a call, from below. "We need to send a probe," she said. Ung hesitated. "Evelyn, we don't even know if it's... Launch it." Moments later, the Hades 3, a state-of-the-art autonomous submersible, was released into the abyss. As it descended past the midnight zone into the eternal blackness of the Hadal depths, the research team huddled around the monitors, watching in silence. At 8,000 meters, the camera captured the first movement, a shadow darting across the screen, something too fast for its size. At 9,500 meters, the lights flickered. A shape emerged from the darkness, an anglerfish unlike any species known. It was massive, its translucent skin revealing pulsating organs. Its bioluminescent lure wasn't a mere light. It pulsed, changing in eerie sequences. But the most disturbing part was its eyes, milky, yet aware. Then, at exactly 10,000 meters, the signal stopped. The monitor went black, and a single message flashed across the screen, typed in jagged, glitching letters. "Go back!" The room fell into silence. Then something knocked against the ship's hull from below. The sound came again, a deep, resonant knock against the steel hull of Orpheus, vibrating through the floor like a heartbeat. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, floating above the deepest trench on Earth. Nothing should be able to reach them from below, and yet something had. Dr. Evelyn Carter forced herself to breathe. "It could be debris," she said, though even she didn't believe it. Lucas Ung was already scanning the sonar again. His hands trembled as he adjusted the settings. No debris. But there's something..." His voice trailed off. His skin had gone pale. "What?" Evelyn demanded. He swallowed hard. "There's movement below us." Evelyn leaned over his shoulder. The sonar feed pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves. Then, a shape. It was huge. At first, she thought it was a false reading, an error, a trick of the abyssal depths. But no, the shape was moving, slowly, deliberately, rising, and it was directly beneath them. The ship's intercom crackled. "Captain Hale, to all personnel, report to your stations immediately." The tension in the room snapped. Evelyn rushed to the bridge, her heart pounding against her ribs. The rest of the senior crew were already there. Captain Jonathan Hale, a veteran of deep-sea expeditions, stood rigid, staring out the bridge window as if expecting to see something breach the surface. "We've lost contact with Hades 3, he said. Evelyn's stomach dropped. "What? It's gone, no signal, just..." The captain exhaled sharply. "Nothing." Burst into the bridge behind her. "Captain, sonar is picking up something." He hesitated. "Something big." "How big?" Hale's voice was sharp. Ng's face twitched. "Big enough that it shouldn't be alive." The ship lurched. A deep, groaning vibration rattled through the hull, like the ship was being dragged downward. Evelyn grabbed onto the nearest console, her breath catching in her throat. "What the hell was that?" someone shouted. The answer came from the sonar feed. The shape was no longer below them. It was circling. Full power! Get us out of here! Captain Hale barked the order, his voice edged with something rare. Fear. The engines roared to life. Orpheus began to move, then the power cut out. Every screen went dark. The lights overhead flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic knocking, as if something out there was testing the ship's strength. Then a sound none of them would ever forget. A voice, not human, not natural. A guttural, distorted whisper crackled through the radio system, words spoken in a voice that sounded like it had never been meant for human ears. You do not belong here. The bridge filled with static. Evelyn pressed her hands to her ears, but it was inside her skull, an overwhelming, suffocating presence. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the whisper vanished. Silence. The screens flickered back to life. The sonar showed nothing, and the knocking had stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then, a scream. From below deck, Evelyn and Hale locked eyes before bolting for the source. The lower decks were dimly lit, the emergency lights casting everything in a sickly red glow. They reached the corridor leading to the engineering room and stopped dead. The metal bulkhead door was torn open, not bent, not dented, ripped apart as if by claws. And on the floor, something wet, a thick, black liquid pooled across the metal grating, trailing toward the open door like a smear of ink. A shadow moved inside the room. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Is that—" A figure staggered out. It was Dr. Holloway, the ship's lead engineer, or what was left of him. His suit was torn, exposing his chest, where something had been etched into his skin. Deep, jagged symbols carved with unnatural precision. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes, wide, bloodshot, locked onto Evelyn. Then in a whisper so faint she almost missed it, he rasped, "It's still here." Then the lights cut out, and the ship screamed. The ship screamed, not metal groaning under pressure, not the howl of the wind over the waves. This was something else, a living sound reverberating through the steel, vibrating in their bones. Then, silence. The lights flickered back, dim and weak. Evelyn's breath hitched as she saw Dr. Holloway collapse onto the floor, his body convulsing. Blood pooled beneath him, the strange symbols carved into his skin pulsing, as if something inside him was alive. Captain Hale knelt beside him, pressing fingers to his throat. His jaw tightened. "He's gone." The words felt unreal. Just minutes ago, Holloway had been alive, breathing, talking, human. Now he was a mangled, bleeding warning. "What the hell did this?" Evelyn whispered. Lucas Ung's voice trembled behind them. "No, not what." He swallowed hard. "Where is it now?" A sound, a drip, a single wet drop of black liquid splashed onto Evelyn's shoulder. Cold, oily, the same substance smeared across the floor. Her stomach lurched. Slowly, she tilted her head up, toward the ceiling. The thing clung to the metal beams above them, its form half-seen, shifting as if its body refused to obey normal physics. Long, spindly limbs twitched, ending in claws too sharp, too thin. Its skin was slick, translucent in places, showing glimpses of things moving inside it, things that weren't organs. But its face, God, its face. It had the same grotesque features as a black devil anglerfish, a wide gaping maw filled with needle-thin teeth. A bioluminescent lure dangled above its head, but it didn't glow. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, in sync with their heartbeats. Then it moved. It dropped from the ceiling. Evelyn screamed as it landed with an unnatural wet thud, its elongated limbs folding beneath it before it started crawling toward them. Hale pulled his gun and fired. The shot echoed, but the thing didn't flinch. The bullet ripped through it, but there was no wound, only a ripple, as if it was made of something not quite solid. The thing laughed, a choked, gurgling sound like drowning lungs trying to form a voice. It didn't come from its mouth, it came from inside their heads. Then it spoke. "You took one of ours." Evelyn's mind raced. Took one. Hades-3, the probe. It had sent a signal. It had seen something it wasn't supposed to see. The thing lurched forward. The crew ran. They tore through the corridors, their boots slamming against the metal grates. The thing moved faster, its limbs skittering, its body shifting, stretching, bending in ways that should have been impossible. Evelyn could hear it whispering, but the words weren't in English. They weren't in any human language. The sounds were wet, like something speaking from the bottom of the ocean, filled with clicks and guttural echoes. Tripped. Evelyn turned just in time to see the thing descend upon him. He screamed as the creature's jaw unhinged, its needle-like teeth elongating as it clamped down on his leg. There was a sickening crunch. Evelyn grabbed his arm, yanking him back. Hale fired again. This time the bullet hit the thing's lure, the bioluminescent appendage above its head. The thing shrieks. A sound so high-pitched, so unnatural that Evelyn felt something in her skull fracture. The walls shook, and for a brief moment, its grip on Ung loosened. Hale pulled a knife from his belt and sliced through the creature's limb. It didn't bleed. It dissolved. Black, inky tendrils curling into the air like smoke. Gasping, clutching his bleeding leg, scrambled back. What the hell is this thing?" Hale didn't answer. He grabbed Ung and threw his arm over his shoulder. "We need to get to the lab, now!" Evelyn turned to follow, and then she froze. Something was moving outside the ship. Through the reinforced glass porthole, the abyss stretched in every direction, black and endless. But something was in that blackness. Shapes, hundreds, no thousands, all of them watching. A field of glowing lures blinked in the distance, pulsing in the same eerie pattern as the first signal. Evelyn's breath hitched. They weren't dealing with just one creature. They had disturbed something ancient, and it was not alone. The ship groaned. The metal walls bent inward as if unseen hands were pressing against them from the outside. The air thickened, the pressure changing. Then the voice returned. "You do not belong here." And the glass began to crack. The first fracture split through the porthole with a sound like snapping bone. Evelyn stumbled back, heart hammering as the jagged crack crawled across the thick glass, forming a spidery web of impending doom. The pressure outside was crushing, the kind that could turn a human body into pulp in seconds if the hull gave way. "We need to move, now!" Hale barked, yanking Ung toward the corridor, but Evelyn couldn't tear her eyes away from the things outside. Hundreds, no, thousands of angler-like creatures loomed in the darkness, their pulsing lures forming an impossible constellation in the abyss. But these weren't just fish. Their eyes were too large, too aware, and their bodies, some of them had limbs, too many limbs. And they were waiting, watching. The thing inside the ship screeched, a sharp clicking noise like teeth grinding against bone. It was speaking again, not to them, outside. The crack in the glass widened. A thin stream of freezing seawater hissed through, splattering onto the metal floor. The pressure change sent a deep groan through the ship's frame. If the window shattered, the Orpheus would flood in seconds. Then, another sound. From the radio. It was static at first, then a voice. Faint, distant, human. Hades-3, and you read... Evelyn's blood ran cold. The probe, the one they had sent into the depths, the one that had vanished. Hale grabbed the radio. "This is Captain Jonathan Hale of the Orpheus. Identify yourself." Silence. Then, "Help. Please, for God's sake. We..." The voice cut out, replaced by a gurgling, wet distortion, not static, drowning. And then, "It's in us." The glass gave. A sharp, deafening crack ripped through the ship as the porthole shattered. Water exploded inward, hitting Evelyn with the force of a cannon blast. She was thrown backward, hitting the metal floor with a sickening thud. Cold. The water was so impossibly cold. The emergency bulkhead slammed shut, sealing off the flooding section, but not before she saw it. A hand, reaching through the broken glass. A human hand, or at least it used to be. The air was thick with panic. Evelyn coughed up seawater, shivering as she pushed herself up. The emergency alarms wailed, flashing red strobes painting the flooding corridor in sickly pulses of light. Ung was still down, clutching his mangled leg, face pale as paper. Hale grabbed him, hauling him to his feet. "We need to get to the lab now." But Evelyn's mind was still on the hand. She had seen it, a human hand, or something pretending to be one. It had been pressed against the glass from outside. "How is that possible?" she whispered. No one answered, because no one had an answer. The ship groaned. The hull bent inward, warping as something moved outside. The pressure was rising. Something was trying to crush them. They stumbled into the lab, slamming the door shut behind them. Hale grabbed the control panel and manually sealed the door. The sound of metal straining echoed through the ship, like the deep, rattling breath of something enormous. Then, silence. Just the distant drip of seawater and the faint, rhythmic pulsing of the bioluminescent lures outside. Evelyn turned to the main console. The screens were glitching, flickering between static and distorted images. Then, the last transmission from Hades 3. The camera feed blinked to life, and Evelyn's stomach twisted. The feed showed the trench, the Hadal depths stretching infinitely in every direction. The probe's lights illuminated a vast seafloor filled with structures, not rocks, not coral, buildings, ruins. Impossible ruins covered in ancient carvings, twisted symbols not meant for human eyes. Then, movement. Something huge slithered through the ruins. A shape so massive it blocked the camera feed entirely, but just before the screen cut out, Evelyn saw it. A face. No, not one, many. A mass of human-like faces fused together, mouths open in a silent scream. Then, static. The message flickered back onto the screen. 3 words. "It found us." The radio crackled, and a new voice whispered, "You will join us." Then, the metal above them buckled, and the ceiling tore open. The ceiling ripped apart with a metallic shriek, jagged shards of steel curling inward like the broken ribs of a dying beast. The lab was plunged into chaos as seawater poured in, carrying with it something black and writhing. Evelyn screamed, shielding her face as the flood knocked her off her feet. Hale and Ung were swallowed by the current, their bodies tumbling like rag dolls through the frigid water. The room tilted, metal beams groaning under the force of whatever was tearing into the ship. And then they came through. The things, not fish, not human, something between. They slithered from the darkness, moving with a sickening, unnatural fluidity. Their limbs were too long, too thin, their bioluminescent lures pulsing in horrible unison. Their faces, if they could even be called that, were twisted, stretched mockeries of human expressions. But the worst part, Evelyn recognized them. Not personally, but their features, the curve of a cheek, the remnants of what could have been a nose, the hollow sockets where eyes should have been. These were people. Or they had been. Thrashed against the water, coughing as he tried to push himself up. His voice was raw with terror. "What the hell are they?" Hale fired his gun. The bullets ripped through the creatures, but they did not bleed. Instead, their forms shuddered, rippling like ink dispersing in water. Then, as if the bullets had never struck, their bodies reformed. They turned their heads toward Hale, moving with eerie, inhuman synchrony. And then they spoke. Not in words, in his voice, his own voice. "You should not have come here." Hale's face twisted in horror. "Jesus Christ!" One of the creatures lunged. Its elongated fingers wrapped around Hale's throat, lifting him off the ground. His body seized, muscles spasming violently as something black and viscous spread from the creature's grip, seeping into his skin like veins of ink. Evelyn lunged forward. "No!" Hale's mouth opened in a silent scream. His eyes rolled back, his veins bulged, darkening. Then he stopped moving. The creature released him. Hale did not fall. He remained standing, his head slowly tilted downward. His eyes, once blue, once human, were now black as the abyss. And then, in a voice no longer his own, he whispered, "It's inside me." Ung was hyperventilating. What the fuck just happened? Hale turned toward them, too slowly, like a puppet learning how to move its strings. Evelyn staggered back. "Hale!" He took one step forward. His movements were wrong. His arms hung too loosely, his head tilted too far. The blackness in his veins was still spreading, seeping deeper into his skin. Then, in perfect unison, the creature spoke through him. "The abyss does not take, it transforms." A low vibration rolled through the ship. Evelyn felt it in her bones, a sound so deep it hummed in her skull, in her teeth. The creatures shuddered, their lures pulsing. Bright, too bright. Evelyn's vision warped. The room shifted. For a moment she was not in the ship. She was somewhere else, somewhere impossibly deep. She was standing on the ocean floor, the trench stretching endlessly in every direction. The ruins she had seen in the probe's feed were now around her, rising like the remains of an ancient cathedral, carved from impossible stone, covered in words that were not words. And in the distance, it was watching. Something so large, so vast, that her mind refused to comprehend it. It had no true form, only shifting masses of black and silver, thousands of flickering lights, a pulsing bioluminescent body that stretched beyond sight. And then it moved. A single tendril, longer than a skyscraper, rose from the darkness and reached toward her. A voice thundered through the deep, not heard, felt. "Join us!" The vision shattered. Evelyn gasped, her body jerking as she was slammed back into reality. The lab was still flooding, the walls still groaning, but Hale was now inches from her. His face was still his, but his eyes were not. "Evelyn," he whispered, "it's beautiful." Then his mouth split open, not like a scream, like a jaw unhinging, like a deep-sea creature opening wide to swallow its prey. And inside, she saw the abyss staring back at her. Evelyn staggered back as Hale's jaw stretched open, his skin splitting at the corners like wet paper tearing apart. Inside, there were no teeth, no throat, just blackness, an endless, pulsing void, like the deepest part of the trench had been carved into him. And it was moving, a writhing mass of tendrils unfurled from his mouth, each one slick and dripping black ichor. They pulsed, like deep-sea worms twisting in hunger. Then they lunged. Evelyn dove aside just as the tendrils whipped toward her, missing her face by inches. The floor where she had stood hissed, the metal corroding as if touched by acid. "NG, move!" she screamed. Ung was frozen in terror, his injured leg making escape impossible. His wide, panicked eyes locked onto Hale, his friend, his captain, who now stood half human, half something else, his limbs twitching as if his body no longer knew how to be a body. But the worst part, Hale was smiling and laughing, a choking, wet, gurgling laugh. "You don't have to run," he whispered. His voice was layered, his own, but beneath it, a second voice, a deeper, older voice, something from the trench itself. "You will understand soon." Evelyn grabbed Ung and pulled him up. "We need to get to the escape pod." Ung blinked rapidly, still in shock. "Hale, we can't just leave him." "That is not Hale," Evelyn snapped. Hale's head twitched, his neck cracking at an unnatural angle. His eyes, black and empty, locked onto hers. Then he moved, not ran, not lunged. He blurred, a horrible fluidity, like something that no longer obeyed bones and joints, his body sliding toward them with impossible speed. Screamed. Evelyn reacted on instinct. She grabbed a fire extinguisher off the wall and swung. The metal connected with Hale's skull. The impact should have dropped him. It didn't. His head snapped sideways, then righted itself instantly. He didn't flinch, didn't bleed, didn't even acknowledge the hit, and then his jaw opened again. The void inside him pulsed, and the whisper came, not from his throat, but from inside Evelyn's skull. "Come closer." Then the ship lurched. The entire Orpheus tilted, throwing them against the wall as a massive impact rocked the hull. Something had hit them, something outside. Something big. Hale's pupilless eyes widened and, for the first time, he hesitated, as if even he hadn't expected what came next. The walls began to buckle, and then the screaming began. The screams came from the lower decks, dozens of voices, crew members who should have been dead. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Grabbed her arm. "Tell me you heard that." She nodded, too terrified to speak. The screams weren't just human. Some of them were wrong, twisted, wet, like something trying to imitate a voice, but not quite understanding how. Then, thudding footsteps, coming up the corridor. Let out a choked sob. "No! No, 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 no!" Evelyn yanked him toward the emergency ladder. "Go! Go now!" He climbed as fast as he could, dragging his injured leg. Evelyn followed, casting one last look at Hale. He was just standing there, still, watching, and smiling. Then, in that same layered, hollow voice, he whispered, "You think you're escaping?" Then he laughed again. Evelyn felt her stomach turn to ice. They reached the upper deck. The escape pod was just ahead, but the ship was collapsing. The ceiling caved in behind them, and something enormous slammed into the side of the hull. The sound was deafening. Evelyn turned just in time to see it. Through the shattered glass of the bridge window, a shape, vast, unfathomable. A shadow that stretched beyond understanding, flickering with thousands of glowing lures. And then, for the first time, she saw its eye. A single enormous eye, staring directly at her. No malice, no rage, just understanding, as if saying, "I see you." And Evelyn saw something else. Not just one, hundreds, rising from the trench, coming for them. The abyss had woken up, and it was hungry. Evelyn could not move. The eye outside the shattered bridge window was enormous, unblinking, filled with things that should not be there. It wasn't just a pupil. It was a vortex, an endless spiral of depths within depths, reflections of things Evelyn could not understand, things that should have never been seen by human eyes. And then it blinked. The ship lurched. Metal screamed as something wrapped around the hull. The Orpheus was sinking, not just breaking apart, being dragged down. Evelyn grabbed and ran. The escape pod was just ahead, but so was Hale. He stood between them and the pod hatch, his body twitching, his skin still blackening, the darkness seeping through his veins like ink in water. His eyes were gone, just empty, abyssal voids that reflected nothing. His jaw opened. "There is no escape," snapped. "Like hell there is!" He fired the flare gun. The red phosphorus exploded against Hale's chest. For the first time, Hale screamed. The fire spread across his skin, but he didn't burn. He melted. The blackness inside him twisted, tendrils snapping, his body cracking like old porcelain as something inside him recoiled from the light. The walls began to shake, not from Hale, from something else, from outside. Evelyn shoved toward the pod. "Go! Now!" They scrambled inside, slamming the airlock shut just as the ship buckled inward. Through the viewport, they saw Hale, or what was left of him. He was not screaming anymore. He was laughing. A horrible, gurgling laugh, layered with voices that were not his own. And as the escape pod detached, Evelyn realized something. Hale wasn't trying to stop them. He was letting them go, because it did not matter, because they were not escaping, because it was already inside them. The escape pod rocketed away, but something was wrong. Evelyn checked the controls. They weren't ascending, they were going down. No, 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 no! Slammed the emergency override. Nothing. The pod was falling toward the trench. The radio crackled, and then came Hale's voice, but it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from inside the pod, from inside their heads. You cannot leave. You are part of it now. Evelyn turned to His nose was bleeding, so was hers. The pressure was rising. The ocean was pulling them back. And then they saw it. The city. No longer just ruins, it was alive, lit by thousands of lures, pulsing like a heartbeat, a city that had never been built by human hands. Structures that moved, twisting and shifting like something was breathing beneath them. And at the center, the thing that had spoken to them. Not a god, not a creature, the abyss itself, waiting, hungry, calling them home. Evelyn and screamed as the pod hit the depths. The last thing Evelyn saw before the world went black was the pod hatch opening from the outside. Something was already there. Something was waiting for them, something that looked just like her. And then the ocean took them. Evelyn opened her eyes. She was floating, not in water, in something else. It was thick, heavy. It pressed into her skin, into her lungs. But she was not drowning. She was breathing. The darkness was alive. It pulsed around her, inside her, through her. Memories flickered in her mind. The Orpheus, the creatures, the eye in the deep. Where was She turned her head, too slowly. Her body moved wrong, sluggish, like she was not used to it anymore. Was floating beside her. His eyes were open, black. A deep, pulsing black. And then he blinked. His lips moved. No sound came out, but Evelyn heard his voice inside her skull. We are home. The abyss breathed. Evelyn felt it inside her veins. The lures around her pulsed, blinking in synchronized rhythm, as if the ocean itself was speaking. And then she understood. They had never been invaders. They had never been outsiders. They had always belonged to the deep. They had just forgotten. The darkness welcomed her. The transformation was complete. And in the distant world above, a new expedition was launching. New explorers, new intruders. Evelyn smiled. She could already hear them calling, and she would be waiting. The Orpheus never resurfaced. No distress signal, no wreckage, just silence. The official reports called it a catastrophic failure, a deep-sea mission gone wrong, crushed by the pressures of the Mariana Trench. A tragedy. But some people weren't convinced. The final sonar readings showed something strange, something rising from the trench, something big. Then, a signal. The same pulsing frequency that had started it all. And somewhere, in the cold black depths, Evelyn Carter watched, waiting. Because the abyss never forgets. And it was still hungry.